December 17th, 1944. The snow in the Ardennes wasn't falling gently anymore. It was thick, heavy, almost suffocating the forest beneath it. Deep inside that frozen landscape, German General Hasso von Manteuffel stood over a map, his gloved hand resting on the paper as if pressing harder might somehow make it more accurate. His entire offensive depended on what was printed in front of him. Roads, bridges, routes. Every movement of his tanks, every decision of his commanders, all of it came back to these thin black lines on a sheet of paper. But there was a problem. The road in front of him didn't match the road on the map. Not slightly wrong, dangerously wrong. A reconnaissance officer had just returned with the report. The road had been widened, rerouted. A new bridge existed where the map showed none. A path that didn't exist on the map now stretched south through the forest. It was as if the ground itself had changed, and the map had been left behind. For a moment, Manteuffel didn't say anything. Around him, engines of tanks idled in the cold. Men waited for orders that had suddenly lost their certainty. Because in war, a wrong decision costs lives. But a wrong map? A wrong map makes every decision wrong. Within hours, something even more unsettling would happen. German officers searching a captured American soldier would open his map case, and what they found inside would feel almost impossible. The American map was newer, clearer, more detailed. It showed the exact road that Manteuffel's map had missed, the new bridge, the logging track, even elevation lines so precise they could predict how artillery would land. One German officer reportedly stared at it in silence before saying a single word: unfair. Not inaccurate, not surprising, unfair. Think about that. A professional soldier, hardened by 5 years of brutal war, looking at a map and calling it unfair, as if knowing the terrain better than your enemy was somehow cheating. That word tells you everything, because what the Germans were seeing wasn't just a better map. It was something deeper, something they hadn't prepared for, something that had quietly shifted the balance of the war. And to understand how that happened, you have to go back to a moment when the United States Army had no idea what the battlefield even looked like. February 1943, Tunisia. An American lieutenant stands on a rocky hillside, holding a map that might as well have been a guess. The lines are vague, the elevations are wrong. The ridge he's been ordered to capture is nothing more than a rough shape on paper. He doesn't know what's ahead of him. He doesn't know where the enemy is positioned. He doesn't even fully understand the terrain he's about to fight on. And when German forces attack, everything collapses. Units get lost. Orders don't make sense. Artillery is called onto positions that don't exist. Retreat routes lead to nowhere. Within days, thousands of American soldiers are dead, wounded, or captured. Tanks abandoned. Equipment scattered across a desert the maps couldn't even describe properly. And the German verdict is brutal, but accurate. The Americans weren't weak. They weren't cowardly. They were fighting blind. Imagine trying to survive in a situation where every decision you make is based on information that lies to you. That was the American Army in early 1943. But here's where the story changes, because instead of ignoring the problem, they attacked it. Quietly, relentlessly, almost invisibly. Back in Washington, an organization few people had ever heard of began expanding at a speed no one outside its walls fully understood. The Army Map Service. It didn't look like a weapon. It didn't sound like one. There were no explosions, no headlines, no heroic charges. Just rooms filled with people working over tables, drawing lines, calculating distances, turning fragments of information into something that could guide men through chaos. And at the center of it were people no one expected. Young women, many of them barely out of college. Geography students who just months earlier had been sitting in classrooms learning about maps and theory. Now they were creating maps that would decide battles. Their tools weren't rifles. They were pens, light tables, photographs. Hours of focus so intense that a single mistake, a tiny shift in a line, could mean the difference between a safe route and a death trap. They worked long hours, sometimes through the night, copying, correcting, refining. Because somewhere, on a battlefield thousands of miles away, a soldier would unfold one of their maps and trust it with his life. And it had to be right. But maps don't create themselves. They need data. Real data. And that's where the next piece of this story begins, far above the ground, where the risk was just as real. High above occupied Europe, unarmed aircraft flew straight lines across enemy territory. No guns, no protection, just cameras, Pilots flying missions where survival depended on one thing: staying steady. Because the moment they tried to evade, the mission failed. And if the mission failed, the map would be wrong. And if the map was wrong, soldiers would die. So they flew straight, through anti-aircraft fire, through enemy fighters, knowing they couldn't fight back, knowing their only job was to see, to capture images that would later become the lines, the shapes, the details on a map someone else would depend on. And when those images returned, the process began again. Data turned into drawings. Drawings turned into maps. Maps turned into decisions. And decisions turned into survival. What started as a weakness in Tunisia was slowly becoming something else. Something powerful. Something dangerous. Because by 1944, the United States wasn't just making maps. It was building a system. A system that could update faster, adapt quicker, see clearer. And that system was about to be tested on the most important battlefield of the war. Normandy. June 6, 1944. Thousands of men prepared to land on beaches they had never seen. But unlike Tunisia, this time, they weren't blind. They knew the slopes of the sand, the positions of enemy defenses, even hidden structures the Germans believed were secret. They had maps that showed everything. And for the first time, the advantage of knowing the ground didn't belong to the defenders. It belonged to the attackers. And the Germans didn't even realize it yet. Not until they started capturing those maps. Not until they saw their own positions marked on enemy paper. Not until they understood that something had changed. And by the time they did, it was already too late. By the time the first landing craft began cutting through the cold waters toward Normandy, something had already changed, quietly, invisibly, and completely. The men inside those boats didn't fully understand it yet. They were focused on survival, on the chaos waiting for them just ahead. But in their hands, folded carefully inside map cases, was something that had taken over a year to build, not just a map, but a system. A system designed to remove uncertainty from war itself, because war had always belonged to the side that knew the ground better. The defender always had the advantage. They knew the terrain, the hidden routes, the elevation, the natural cover. History had proven it again and again. But Normandy was different. For the first time in modern warfare, an invading army was arriving with a deeper understanding of the battlefield than the army defending it. And that didn't happen by accident. Months before a single soldier stepped onto those beaches, intelligence teams were already working in ways that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. Photographs were being taken from high altitude, stitched together into massive mosaics of terrain. Analysts studied shadows to determine height, soil patterns to understand movement. Even the shape of waves breaking on the shore was analyzed to calculate underwater slopes. Every detail mattered, because every detail meant fewer unknowns, and fewer unknowns meant fewer mistakes. But even that wasn't enough. Because maps based only on photographs still had limits. They could show what something looked like, but not always what it felt like. Not the weight of the sand under a tank, not the firmness of the ground beneath a soldier's boots. And that's where the risk became personal. Under the cover of darkness, small teams moved silently across the water. No large ships, no loud engines, just men carrying basic tools and one objective: touch the enemy's ground without being seen. They reached the beaches in the dead of night, collected samples, measured what they could, then disappeared back into the darkness before anyone knew they were there. It was slow, dangerous, and absolutely critical, because by combining that data with aerial reconnaissance, something extraordinary was created. A map that didn't just show the battlefield, it explained it. When the invasion finally began, those maps turned chaos into something manageable. Soldiers still faced gunfire, explosions, fear, but they weren't guessing anymore. They knew where they were going. They knew what was ahead. They knew what kind of ground they were stepping onto. And that knowledge changed everything. German defenders, on the other hand, believed they had the advantage. They were on their own soil. They had built defenses, hidden positions, reinforced structures. In their minds, much of it was invisible to the enemy. But as the first waves landed, something started to feel wrong. American artillery didn't just hit random areas, it struck precise locations. Defensive positions that were supposed to be concealed were already targeted. Units found themselves under fire before they even engaged. And slowly, an uncomfortable realization began to spread. The enemy wasn't guessing. The enemy knew. Somewhere along the line, the balance had shifted. Not in weapons, not in numbers, but in information. And information, in war, is power. As the battle moved inland, that power only grew stronger. The pace of the American advance increased, and something remarkable began happening. Units were receiving updated maps almost as fast as they moved. A town captured on one day could be mapped, printed, and delivered with updated detail within days. That kind of speed had never existed before. War had always been slower in that sense. Maps were static, outdated by the time they reached the front. But now, they were alive, changing, updating, keeping pace with the battlefield itself. And that created a new kind of advantage, one that wasn't immediately visible, but was felt in every decision, every movement, every successful maneuver. German units, even those who had occupied regions for years, began noticing something strange. The Americans seemed to know the terrain better than they did. They moved with confidence. They chose routes that avoided danger. They attacked from directions that shouldn't have been obvious. It didn't feel random. It felt calculated. And that was unsettling. Because when your enemy knows your environment better than you do, you lose more than just ground. You lose control. But the story doesn't end there. Because as the war moved closer to Germany itself, something even more unexpected began to happen. The system that had been built to understand foreign terrain was now turning inward toward the enemy's own homeland. And at the center of that shift was a different kind of operation. One that didn't rely on observation from above, but on direct access to knowledge that had been hidden for years. As American forces pushed forward, specialized teams followed behind. Not frontline soldiers, not traditional intelligence officers, but experts, engineers, analysts, people who understood maps at a deeper level. Their mission wasn't to fight, it was to find. To locate the hidden structure behind Germany's mapping system. The data, the records, the frameworks that defined how the Germans themselves understood their own terrain. And when they began finding it, everything changed again. Because this wasn't just about capturing information, it was about combining it, taking what the Germans had built over decades, and merging it with a system that could process, update, and deploy it faster than anything they had ever imagined. The result was something the German army had never prepared for, an enemy that didn't just know the ground, but knew it better than the people who had created the original maps. And that's when the word started to make sense. Unfair. Not because of luck, not because of chance, but because the war had quietly evolved into something new. A battle not just of weapons or strategy, but of information. And one side was winning it completely. By the winter of 1944, something inside the German army had begun to break. And it wasn't just their front lines. It was something deeper. Something harder to see, but impossible to ignore once you felt it. Confidence. For years, German commanders had believed in a simple truth. No one could understand their own ground better than they could. It was a rule older than modern warfare itself. The defender always knew more. The defender always had the edge. But now, that rule was collapsing in real time. In the forests of the Ardennes, in the towns along the Western Front, in the villages that German soldiers had passed through for years, something felt wrong. Familiar ground had become unfamiliar. Roads didn't lead where they were supposed to. Routes that seemed safe turned into traps. Movements that should have worked didn't. And at first, no one could explain why, because the problem wasn't obvious. It wasn't a lack of courage, it wasn't a lack of skill, it wasn't even a lack of experience. The problem was that the world they thought they understood had quietly changed without them noticing. Maps, something so basic, so overlooked, had become the difference between control and confusion. And for the German army, that difference was becoming deadly. When captured American maps started circulating through German command posts, the reaction wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was something else. Silence. Officers would look at the sheets carefully, study them, compare them to their own. And slowly, piece by piece, they would realize what they were seeing. These weren't just better maps. They were newer, more precise, more complete. They showed roads that German maps didn't, bridges that had been built recently, terrain details updated to a level that seemed almost impossible for a foreign army. It didn't make sense. How could an enemy, fighting thousands of miles from home, know the terrain better than the soldiers who had lived and operated there for years? That question didn't have an easy answer, because the answer wasn't a single thing. It was a system that had been built quietly, patiently, step by step. While the German army focused on weapons, tactics, and traditional strength, the Americans had invested in something else: information. And not just collecting it, but using it faster than anyone else could. By early 1945, the imbalance had reached a point where it was impossible to ignore. German units moving through their own territory began encountering situations that felt almost surreal. They would advance based on their maps, only to find obstacles where none should exist. They would attempt flanking maneuvers, only to be intercepted as if the enemy had predicted them in advance. And in some cases, American artillery would strike positions with such accuracy that it felt like the enemy was looking directly at them. But they weren't. They were looking at something else: a piece of paper, a map that had been built using photographs, calculations, and data collected over months, sometimes years. A map that was constantly updated, constantly refined, constantly improving, and that was something the German system couldn't match anymore. Their mapping infrastructure had been built for a different kind of war, a slower war, a war where updates could take time, where information moved through structured channels. But this war had changed. It was faster, more dynamic, and their system hadn't adapted. Bombing raids had damaged production, experienced personnel had been lost, communication had broken down, and without realizing it, the German army had lost something critical: the ability to see clearly. Meanwhile, the American system was doing the opposite. It was accelerating, expanding, improving with every passing month. Maps weren't just tools anymore. They were becoming weapons. Not in the traditional sense, but in a way that shaped every decision on the battlefield. Where to move, where to attack, where to avoid. Every choice became sharper, more informed, more effective. And over time, those small advantages added up. Not in a single dramatic moment, but in thousands of quiet decisions, each one increasing the gap, each one pushing the outcome further in one direction, until eventually the difference became impossible to recover from. Imagine being a German officer in those final months, standing over a map that you know is outdated, giving orders based on information you no longer fully trust, watching your units struggle, not because they lack strength, but because they lack clarity, and then holding an enemy map in your hands and realizing that they don't have that problem, that they are moving with a level of confidence you can no longer match, that they see the battlefield more clearly than you do. That moment, that realization, is where the word unfair truly comes from. Not anger, not frustration, but something closer to disbelief, because deep down, they understood what it meant. The war hadn't just been decided by firepower or numbers. It had been decided by preparation, by systems, by the ability to turn information into action faster than the enemy could respond. And once that gap opened, it didn't close. When the war finally ended in 1945, many things were said about why it ended the way it did. People talked about industry, about resources, about strategy, about leadership, and all of those things mattered. But beneath all of them, there was something quieter, something easier to overlook. The work of people who never stepped onto a battlefield. The women who spent hours drawing lines on paper. The pilots who flew unarmed into hostile skies. The analysts who studied images and turned them into knowledge. The engineers who built systems to process it all. They weren't the ones charging forward under fire. They weren't the ones remembered in dramatic stories. But without them, the outcome would have been different. Because war isn't just about fighting, it's about understanding. And the side that understands more wins. Go back one last time to that moment in the Ardennes. Snow falling. Engines running. A general staring at a map that no longer matches reality. In that moment, everything is still undecided. The battle could still go either way. But hidden beneath that moment is a truth that has already sealed the outcome. One side sees clearly, the other does not. And in war, clarity is everything. The German general didn't lose because he wasn't skilled. He didn't lose because he lacked courage. He lost because the world he was relying on, his understanding of the battlefield, was no longer accurate. And by the time he realized it, it was already too late. That is the real story behind the word unfair. Not a complaint, not an excuse, but a recognition that the rules had changed, and one side had adapted faster than the other. And that's the part of history that often goes unnoticed. The quiet work, the invisible systems, the small decisions that build into something unstoppable. Because in the end, wars are not just won by those who fight harder, they are won by those who see better. And sometimes, the most powerful weapon on the battlefield is not a gun, not a tank, not even an army. Sometimes, it's just a map.